Okay, hello everyone. Welcome along to this debate or discussion. We're going to look into medical foods, where they are now, maybe where they've been and where they're going to go. So I'm joined by three people who have a vested interest in the medical foods or medical nutrition area. So firstly, it's Professor Paul Clayton, who's from the University of Pecs in Hungary, and also works with the Institute of Food, Brain and Behaviour at Oxford University. He also does some other things. Maybe he'll tell you a little more when he gets to speak. We have Caulfield, who is a nutrition consultant with a global focus, and is also attached to the American Association for Anti-Aging. Is that correct?
That's right.
There we are. And Mikail Hendriks, who's the CEO of a company called Medical Brands, and they have some products which are specialised in the medical devices route, which if you don't know anything about it, you soon will, because Michael's going to tell you about what his company does in that avenue. So, but we're going to look at medical foods and medical nutrition in a broad kind of way. So I think we might start off. I mean, one of the things that is of interest in this area is the fact that maybe the medical system as we know it is very expensive in terms of when people get sick and they have to go to hospitals. The drug system, it's very expensive, and for a lot of observers and maybe for a lot of governments, it's almost unsustainably expensive. I mean, we'll start with you, Catherine.
Yeah.
What's your insight into the medical system as we know it today?
Well, I think bearing in mind that today, on average, European countries have a spend of approximately 9% of GDP on health, on their health budgets, and in the area of medical nutrition, the main focus so far has been in the area of mainly the elderly or malnutrition. And also obesity is obviously a big subject. However, on the other side, consumer demand in the last years has constantly driven a massive demand as a result of a requirement and an interest in much better quality of life, and also prevention of chronic illness. And that is in fact driving the demand as we see it today for better health and better quality of life.
So do you have some, I mean, are there some figures? I mean, what kind of costs are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, if you take some examples, one area of, for example, child well-being, when we're looking into the future which is important, I think, for all of us. And in the civilized world, in the Western world today, we're still experiencing over 20% of malnutrition with children. And I think a number of obviously the key focus of the Vitafoods, as it's been, is actually creating a platform for better health and better child well-being for the future. So that's just one example. Now, another statistic which may be surprising for us in modern day society in the Western world is also, for example, 300,000 maternal mortalities in the Western world as a whole. And in fact, many of these mortalities are just occurring as a result of things like hypertension or infection, and possibly things that could be avoided as a result of the right individual nutrition strategies.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. What would you say, Paul, in terms of the burden, the public health cost burden of the medical style system that we tend to have today in most Western nations?
The current medical system that we're laboring under is absolutely ruinous. It's inappropriate for this century and for the patterns of public health disease that we have currently to try to find ways of dealing with. The problem is that we live in a QWERTY universe. By that I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with this metaphor, we are burdened with technologies and systems which really have their roots in a set of social and economic circumstances that were present 100 years ago. They're no longer appropriate for the problems we have to deal with now. If you go back to 19th century healthcare profiling, what you find is a population who lived as long as we do today, if you take life expectancy at age 5, but they didn't have very much degenerative disease at all. In other words, the phenomenology of aging that we witness today is an artifact. It is not natural. It is not natural to develop more cancer or more heart disease or more Alzheimer's as you grow older. But if you live in a very toxic food environment, as we do today, and if all you can be treated with are the rather trivial and ineffective tools that the medical profession currently utilizes, which are Pasteurian in origin, then you're doomed. You have a medical system which is ineffective, which can do nothing to prevent the increasing pandemics of degenerative disease, and which, between you and me, kills a lot of the patients. It's not an effective model at all. We desperately need to move to a Bernardian system of healthcare, where healthcare can be delivered not through a healthcare profession, not at a pharmacy, not at the point of prescription, but at your supermarket checkout counters. That is the only way to make something that's more effective and more cost effective. Right now, we're looking at trends which are telling us that the incidence of cancer is going to double in the next 20 years, the incidence of Alzheimer's will treble. Part of this is a follow-on to the problems we have with obesity and type 2 diabetes. We can't afford the burdens of disease we have already. So the projected increases lead to bankruptcy. And in fact, in Britain, more than half of our healthcare trusts are already bankrupt. And you set this against a bleak macroeconomic backdrop. Friends, this is the road to ruin. We cannot continue like this. And so for this reason, a lot of mediconomists are now looking at the types of savings that could be made and the improved quality of healthcare that could be delivered by switching to a food-based system. The onus is on us to prove that case. We actually have now a lot of the data needed to do so. And the mediconomists who are looking at our data are now starting to inform the policymakers. And eventually we'll drag the politicians and even the regulators kicking and screaming into a new age of medicine. And it won't be very much to do with pharmaceuticals.
When you look around what you see here at this show as an example of healthy kinds of foods and supplements that maybe can operate in the way that you're saying, do you see that a lot of potential, you know, in terms of changing nutrition patterns and dietary intakes?
But it's a lot of unrealized potential, because the people who are selling cranberry extract, and I don't mean to insult anyone here who sells cranberry extract.
Michael sells cranberry extracts, be careful.
Are telling us that it's the answer to everything, but the people who are selling bilberry extract say the same thing, and the fish oil people say the same thing. If only human health were that simple. You need to get a lot of things right, because given your current sedentary urbanized lifestyle and the appalling diets that most people eat in the real world, you are depleted in just about everything. And there is no one single extract that can put that right.
But I think, Paul, you would agree that the positive side of this is that the positive side of the equation is that the consumer, utilizing obviously modern technologies as they are available, is increasingly more competent and informed of possible health strategies and certainly preventative measures to improve health. So in fact there is a significant amount of consumer-driven demand in this direction for better health, and to utilize actually the main ingredients that have been and the products that have been demonstrated at the exhibition. Now if I take just a few examples of some of the things that I've seen here at Vitafoods, I mean we are aware that major illnesses, major chronic diseases, really you can say mainly stem from inflammatory responses. And if you look at many of the ingredients that are here demonstrated at the Vitafoods, we have a great number of ingredients that actually are supporting inflammatory reduction of the inflammatory response. There are also a great many ingredients that are supporting the just general well-being, also vascular support, providing vascular support, also increasing ATP, enhancing endurance, enhancing energy, and these are all subjects that are key in the minds of the consumer, and they're in fact driving that demand, and the consumer will demand these products to be made available.
Now, Michael, you're a manufacturer of some of these kinds of products that are quite specific. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your products do?
Yeah, so Medical Brands develop self-care medical devices. These are products which are have a physical mode of action rather than an immunologic, pharmacologic or metabolic action. Because if you would have that kind of mode of action, you will be a drug. And we demonstrate medical claims. So if you make a medical claim, you're automatically either a drug or a medical device. And then based on the mode of action and then the classification of the risk model, you have a different category.
This is in EU law.
It's an EU law, but it's also harmonized in many other countries, Middle East, Australia, South Africa. So yeah, there's a lot of harmonization. What happened actually? It's a very fast-moving category right now. We did in May 2012. We did a count because at this moment I cannot exactly use IMS data or AC Nielsen figures to say how big is the market for these self-care medical devices. So yeah, basically the team and I went into the pharmacies and the health retail stores and just started to look at CE marks on packages. And we counted in May 2012 140 products. We did it again a count this year in January 2014. Now there are 240 products. So in less than 1.5 years there's 100 new medical device products on the market. Some people say that some of the products have like a health claim kind of character. I want to make clear that this is not for these medical devices. They have a physical mode of action. There's clinical data that show you can treat people with a disease. So by this definition, it's a medical device. There is some discussions also going on about some recent withdrawals on the market as medical devices. Used to be also some of them Pacs-based, for example, if you talk about cranberries. And some large manufacturers and brands have been pulled, and the reason for that is that they were promoting it also as a food supplement. So if you, and that's the same with a health claim, if you promote a food supplement with a medical claim, you're either a drug or a medical device. You're not allowed to do that. So if you use food supplement studies in medical devices, it will not work, and that's what the cases showed. So you have to do the science, you have to do clinical data, you have to show that the product works and that you can treat and prevent the diseases.
In this case, the cranberry product that you marketed it as preventing and treating urinary tract infections, and then your products have been criticised because they wonder how you can say that as a medical device, whereas a food supplement can't even say that it prevents UTI. So, I mean, I guess that you would say it's a matter of differing kinds of science that demonstrates these benefits.
Yeah, I'm not a specialist in food supplements. Let's make that clear. I'm a specialist in medical devices. And we have had many discussions with competent authorities in the past for other products. We have also wart removal products in the markets, which has been a lot of questions about in the past. And you see that there's discussions in every angle where you're talking about there's similar products on the market either as a drug or as a food supplement. But basically, if you can show physical mode of action, and you show that you can cure or treat the disease or prevent the disease, then yeah, and you market it as a medical device, then you are a medical device. And I mean, if I would market it as a food supplement, then people would ask me the questions: are you a borderline product?
But why do you come, if it's a medical device, why do you even come to Vitafoods?
Well, show me the self-care medical device exhibition, I will go there. There is none. So this is the fastest growing category in self-care, and the companies who should be monitoring have no systems to monitor it, and at this moment it's getting we say it established. But there's another problem, Shane, if I can make notice, is that if you want to make a self-care medical device, where would I buy my ingredients? I mean, I can buy food grade ingredients, I can buy pharma grade ingredients, I can buy cosmetic grade ingredients, but there is no medical device grade ingredient. So I would then have to go to a pharma grade ingredient, which is being released on pharmaceutical effectiveness, but which I'm not allowed to have as a medical device. So realize the homework that we need to do as a manufacturer. We have to go back into the science, show the physical mode of action. If there's pharmaceutical activity, we have to take it out, filtering, whatever we need to do, and then we have to redo all the clinical data, right? So it's not something you can just take from a food supplement. So you have to realize it's a lot of science behind it, and sometimes for some of the products it takes us 7 years to develop.
Well, what do you think of these kinds of products, Paul? Are these the kinds of products where it's a botanical, in the case of the cranberry, a botanical-based extract with a medical-style intervention? Do you see those kinds of products as offering a lot of potential?
Well, I do. Whether it's a phytochemical or whether it's a fish oil, the idea that you can attach a comprehensible claim to it, I think, is key. Because I want to come back to something that you said, Catherine, the idea of the informed and self-motivating and aspirational consumer. I don't buy that for 1 minute. I do agree that there is a consensus emerging amongst clinical scientists that, for example, chronic inflammation is clearly playing a role in initiating and promoting many of the diseases that characterize 21st century public health. Right. And if you know what causes chronic inflammation and how to modify it, it's very easy to switch off. And if you add the right polyphenols and the omega-3s, you can damp down chronic inflammation to the point where it is no longer driving disease. But of course, if you do that, you have to prime the innate immune system. Otherwise, if you have no inflammatory responses at all, you're prone to infection. So you've got to add your beta-glucans. Your 1316 is all caseurine, acting via rhamnose receptors. And if you're going to do that, you've got to make sure the microflora is right, which means a blend of prebiotic fibers. Yeah, we can do all this. And if you were to do all that, you wouldn't get degenerative disease. About 9/10 of all degenerative disease would simply not happen. The only people who would still get sick would be those people who've got risk-denoting genes, such as BRCA1 and BRCA2. So I think the consumer is completely confused, and the more information that comes from Pasteurian-orientated companies like this saying, I've got the answer to this, and I've got the answer to that. Of course, they have to say that because it's a commercial incentive. But it's, from a public health perspective, it's nonsense. And our problem is, it's the bloody Daily Mail. Because this kind of information is not being given to the consumer in a way that they can use. You know, one day, calcium is going to protect your bones. The next day, it's going to give you heart disease. And the consumers end up disempowered, alienated, and frightened. They're not informed, and it's very difficult to create a GUI that will actually take all of this complex science and give it to them, to a non-professional, non-trained people in accessible terms.
So is the industry failing a little bit then in that communication challenge, and also is it also then governments that maybe are not backing these kinds of programs, you know, to eat healthier and live more healthily?
Well, I personally think that is the dilemma, in fact, that we're facing. That whereas with a pharmaceutical product, you have a medical professional who's recommending that or who's administering that. On the other hand, on the other side, with a food ingredient or with an active ingredient, we don't know. The consumer himself cannot judge the dosage if he's taking a whole bulk of various ingredients. However, I think we all agree that the potential is there. The consumer is driving a certain requirement on the industry, and I think it's for us to work out solutions to bring the right effects that the consumer is looking for.
But I think Margaret Chan has really given the industry something to think about. In the statement that she made here in Geneva last year.
Margaret Chan from the WHO.
Director General of the WHO. Yeah. And she made a very interesting speech in which she identified the food industry as being a very important contributor to the burdens of public health that we are confronted with today. And she said, it's your responsibility to get things right. Now, I'm in a very fortunate position. I can tell you that one or two of the major players actually took this on board. And there is at least one group that I'm working with that is moving from consumer functionality towards real physiological functionality. Now, I used to treat individual patients. At medical school, we're taught to treat the disease, not the symptoms. But if all you've got to work with is pharmaceutical products, that's all you end up treating are the symptoms. That's all that pharmaceuticals can do in almost all cases, except for the antibiotics, which don't work anymore. So, but I don't regard individuals as really diseases either. They are symptoms of a food chain and a lifestyle which is extremely pathological for all of you. And that's where we need to act. So I think that getting the food companies to work on this and then putting up the price of petrol by about a factor of 10, so people have to walk more and can't take elevators and have to take, building more physical activity into people's lives and perhaps using economic leverage to do so if you have to. But you can't do that either. That's what Ed Miliband has just been trying to do in Britain. He wants to put a tax on different kinds of foods, force people to eat more healthily. But who trusts the government anymore? And they've got, with good reason. Nobody likes the nanny state. So I'm not quite sure how to square this circle. Catherine, you're closer to this than I am. How do we solve this problem?
But one question there. I mean, how important are the medical professionals in terms of advocating nutritional solutions or nutritional interventions as opposed to medical interventions?
Okay, I've got to be careful how I talk about this because I teach at a number of universities and I teach doctors and medical students. So how shall I put it? They're bloody useless. Absolutely bloody useless, because they get no training. When I did a 7-year medical course, an old school course, and there were 3 hours of nutrition in that, which covered nothing. Absolutely useless. Most doctors do not know about nutrition, let alone pharmaconutrition, and there is no point, if you get sick, in going to your doctor to asking him about, you know, even basic nutritional issues, unless you're very, very lucky and find someone who's taken the trouble to do a bit of background research. Talk to someone like Catherine.
Although there again, I'm seeing a positive trend there to an extent, Shane. I mean, if you look at the work of the American Academy of Anti-Aging, its actually focus is to look at increasing quality of life and supporting. And these are medical professionals. Now, they are looking at, with a major focus on prevention and supporting patients in achieving a better prevention, better solutions for good health. And I think that is a trend that we are also seeing. So there is support on that side too. But
say from the likes of the American Medical Association, is there any shift from them in terms of introducing nutritional
there are a lot of
materials onto the syllabuses of medical students and in the work of doctors as well?
There are a growing number of medical professionals recommending supplements and nutritional solutions today, and in fact so I think that is a positive trend on that side. And I mean, bearing in mind, we talked initially about the status on the consumer side, but I think bearing in mind that our life expectancy has actually doubled in the last 100 years, and on the other side of the equation, we have a lifestyle that is ever more demanding. That's quite logical that that's going to create quite a great awareness among all parts of the value chain, all parts of the interest groups.
I have to respond to that.
Sure.
Life expectancy has not doubled in the last century. This is a myth that you'll hear talked about by doctors who have a vested interest in telling you how wonderful they are. In fact, life expectancy, if you filter out the first 5 years after birth, which are high risk, life expectancy at the age of 5 in 1870 matches what we see today. There has been no increase. And if you break it down, you find that most of the apparent increase in life expectancy is due to reductions in perinatal mortality. People who reach the age of 50 or 60 are not living very much longer today than they were 100 years ago, and they are certainly not living any longer today than they were 130 years ago. Because 130 years ago, people were eating much more healthily, and they were physically much more active, which means AMPK is active, mTOR is down, and you don't get diabetes and any of the acceleration of the aging process that diabetes brings along with it. So we have to be very, very critical about stories like that. We're not living any longer. The increase in degenerative disease is nothing to do with an aging population. It is to do with the fact that we live in a toxic food environment, and we live in a toxic, urbanized, sedentary lifestyle. That is what makes us so sick. It means that we have a poorer health expectancy than our great-great-grandfathers and mothers did. They actually could expect to retain full physical, mental, and sexual functionality till the last months or weeks before they died. We can expect to spend the last 10% of our lives in a state of progressive medical dependency. And I'm telling you, that is an artifact. That is not the way humans have to age. That is a 20th century description of aging, but it is a series of phenomenological changes which are not intrinsic. I had to respond to that because that is not any longer tenable.
No, I think we agree that my opinion is life expectancy is extending, but it's increasing.
If you go back 100 to 1900, it does. You go back further, and it goes right back up again, and actually it exceeds what we have now. And this has been printed in 4.5 impact journals and accepted.
Okay.
And what we're seeing now also is life expectancy is starting to fall back in various parts of the world, which you would expect because of the pandemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes must be regarded as a form of accelerated aging. And it's not surprising that life expectancy is now beginning to fall back, specifically in black women in the United States. We're seeing that in large parts of the FSU and in many other parts of the world. These inevitable gains that we were taught to expect are not inevitable. We're now starting to lose them. The first canaries in the coal mine are already dying. And I'll tell you something else. Sorry, I'm going on a bit. There's a wonderful meta-analysis of IQ studies that was published recently in the journal Intelligence. And they've looked at a whole series of studies of IQ testing going back to 1880. looking at basically reaction times, visual response times, which is a kind of dipstick method of looking at overall intellectual and cognitive processing. And there's been a slowing since 1880, representing an average fall in healthy middle-aged populations of 15 IQ points. 15 IQ points. In other words, the same appalling dysnutritional lifestyles that are making us sick physically are also degrading our cognitive abilities. 15 IQ points. I could not afford to lose that, and nor could any of you. But that's what's happening.
If anyone's come in late, this is Professor Paul Clayton. He's not actually on the board there because he came in as a late speaker to the debate. But before we move on into some other subjects, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask at all at this point in the discussion? Okay.
Sean, maybe I could make a comment.
Yeah,
just on,
please.
There we go.
Yes, we have a question. Do you want to just say who you are, sir? And you can use this.
Hello, I'm the CEO of the Russian company who is developing new products for food products. For physical activity. And I would like to know, what is your approach? How should we survive in this, I would say, progressive medical dependency and toxic food environment? What should we do?
Okay, that's a huge question. That's a huge question. Okay.
Don't eat.
Yes, very easily. What should we focus on?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say zdravstvuyte. And I would say that if we all want to survive, first of all, we should try and encourage those crazy American neoconservatives to get out of Syria and the Ukraine. That would be the first step. The second step, I think, don't go to your doctors. Just eat healthily. Leave the cities. Go and buy a small holding. Work with your hands. Get the dirt under your nails. Eat what you can produce and get the sun on your back. That's going to make you a whole lot healthier than you are now.
Do you think before that, if that happens, or before that may happen, is there a place for supplements and those kinds of nutritional interventions? I mean, in an ideal world, there probably would never be a need for these things. But
yeah,
do you see them as a
okay.
as a valid nutritional input?
Yes, I do. If you're living a 21st century urbanized and sedentary lifestyle, if you're living at about 2,000 calories a day, which is not what we were designed to do, you're going to be multiply depleted. And that's going to affect your health. It's going to mean you're chronically inflamed. You probably have a dysbiosis. You probably have immunological dysfunction and imbalance. And there is a place for comprehensive supplementation. But that's the problem with the industry that we have here. Everyone is selling their own vested interest. And that's not what people need, either individually or at the public health level. I think there are increasingly amongst the medical profession groups like A4M who I've talked for in the past and I know very well and I appreciate. They're good people, but they're still a minority. I wish we had more medics who supported this kind of strategy. I think hopefully things will get better.
I'm not a medical professional, Paul, but I actually, my focus is actually biotechnology and nutrition. So I'm on the positive side, viewing the focus on preventative health as very positive. Now, I think getting back to what you said about some of the challenges that the consumers are facing, I think that is exactly the point. We're experiencing, if you look at statistics today, we're experiencing, for example, eye diseases today in patients of 40s, in the 40s and 50s that previously would only be experienced in the 60s.
Exactly.
And similar with various other ailments. Yeah. And these are the key topics that people are trying to avoid, and increasing quality of life in response to the demands that have been placed on them, but also ensuring that until old age, they are feeling healthy, active, and living a full life, and enjoying a full life. And I think that is exactly the topic that we need to focus on.
Michael, do you feel like you look around here and see the various attempts or the products that are available and the ingredients trying to solve some of these problems, or bring products to the market that do these kinds of things as are being discussed now? Do you think that a good job is being done?
Well, I've not been walking around here, Shane, but what I see, from personal experience, what we have with our products is, if you're looking at urinary tract infections, people first try these cranberry juices, which have maybe borderline claim or no claims at all, and then suddenly until they are in so much pain, they go to the doctor, get antibiotic treatment. Right? And what we try to do is get the step before that, because we see that you still might need an antibiotic treatment, but in most of the cases, your UTI is not that severe that you need an antibiotic treatment, so you can go in the stage before, where you not have a complete systematic effect. And if you then look at the medical device, I mean, if you have a problem, what can you do? How would you fix it? You can do immune system, metabolism, pharmaceutical actions. I mean, this is all reaction inside your body. And what we claim is like a pair of glasses. So you put a pair of glasses on, you can see, you take them off, I didn't change anything to the body. And this is what medical devices can do for you.
Did you get support from the medical, are your products recommended by doctors?
Yes, they are, but the problem we have is going into the pharmacies, because the people that are having urinary tract infections today go to the doctor, get a recipe, and go to the pharmacist to buy, to get an antibiotic or whatever. It depends on which country you are. So how do I sell my product in the pharmacy then? Because the pharmacy will never go against the doctor's advice. So we are doing a lot of marketing and information and giving science and 3D movies on internet and try to educate the professionals. But yeah, I'm not very hopeful actually.
Mm-hmm. But as you know, in addition to some of the comments that I made earlier about some of the exciting supplements and solutions that are being offered at the exhibition, you know, it's absolutely clear that when you look around as a whole, that there is already looking at the great many suppliers, great many producers, suppliers, etc. That are here. That not only do we have a scientific level of quality of ingredients, of products, of solutions for better health. But in fact, there are also, what occurred to me is a number of very long-term existing qualified technology companies that are providing technology and measurement techniques and devices that are actually proving the quality of the ingredients and the supplements and the raw materials that are being provided here at the fair. So in fact, if we look at the entire offering at Vitafoods, we in fact are covering with a very high level of qualified positive effect on health, the entire scope
life
of
cycle.
Life
so
cycle.
If a family
yeah.
actually had to live inside the Vitafoods hall for their entire life, they could be very healthy and happy.
Well, I think we all agree we don't want to go back. We don't want to go to space nutrition and only eating pills. But certainly, there is an immense platform of scientifically proven, very high quality products which cover the entire scope of health and preventative health and well-being.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine. I think we have another question here from this gentleman. Want to introduce yourself, sir?
Hi, my name is Paul Dunn from Sure Pharma in Ireland, and I would just like to pose a question to the panel. Just in terms of regulation that we see in terms of a pharmaceutical product, there's stringent regulation to get that product from early stage development right through to commercial stage. Should we be putting more emphasis from a government and a regulatory point of view on food producing companies? Because it seems to get a product onto the shelf from a consumer's point of view that allows increase in sugar, salt content, it does not seem to be a problem. And I think this is something that we haven't tackled, that we've just let go and miss. So I'd just like to maybe grab the attention of the panel for that. And the second question we've also mentioned in terms of the toxic environment, I'd just like to direct this question to Paul Clayton. Is it physical activity or is it food consumption? Which would you regard as the number 1 and 2 in terms of health and longevity?
Shall I tackle the second question first?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, my group has published a series of papers on exactly this, and there's many other scientists, good scientists, who've examined this. We were designed, and I'm not using this in the sense of intelligent design, but we were designed in the evolutionary crucible as being, I suppose, hunters or gatherers, or some combination of that. We were not designed to run at 2,000 calories a day, which is within 30% of BMR. Now, if you go back 100 years, the mid-Victorians were consuming between 3.5 to 7,000 calories a day because no internal combustion engine, no high-tech, no convenient technology. You know,
They had the horse.
Horses are pretty hard work, if any of you do horse riding. And they didn't have very much processed foods either. So they're consuming large amounts of very unprocessed foods. And you can break that down. They're eating a lot of omega-3s because 150 years ago, salmon and oysters are the foods of the poor. They're eating very large amounts of fruits and vegetables, of about 10 portions a day. And those are not the same types of fruits and vegetables that we're eating now. They're heirloom strains which have high levels of phytonutrients. So right away we know they're consuming a whole range of phytoalexins at about an order of magnitude greater than the consumption patterns we see today. They're extraordinarily protected, and the public health figures show us that that indeed was the case. Now, if you're living at 2,000 calories a day, when we can live astonishingly sedentary lifestyles now, there was a report in the Proceedings of the Mayo Clinic, which came out 2 months ago, which showed that obese women in America, the level of activity, physical activity that they're undertaking works out at about a day a year. We're no longer Homo sapiens, we're Homo sedescens. We sit down. They're getting out of bed and they're sitting down. They're going to the breakfast bar and sitting down, going to the car and sitting down, going to the office and sitting down. We were not designed to run at 2,000 calories a day. And if you're only eating that very small amount of food, and you're making poor food choices as well, because of this toxic food environment I keep referring to that we live in, a lot of empty calories, an abnormal omega-6-3 ratio, an abnormal sodium to potassium magnesium ratio, too many ages and ales because of high temperature, fast processed foods, you're doomed to degenerative disease well before your time. So it's a combination of these things. They act together, they're synergistic, and the overall impact of these very negative factors you can see in the clinics and the hospitals and in the graveyards. Now, I think I'm not being really fair here. Let me hand the second question over to my fellow panelists, because I don't think they're getting enough airtime.
Well, the first question.
Yeah.
About sorry. What was your first question, sir? Sorry.
In terms of regulation standards, in terms of producing, developing a food commodity to put on your standard consumer shelf versus the regulation that a pharmaceutical takes from the point of development to commercial, should we be focusing clearly on more stringent regulation in terms of food industry?
So he's asking, should we be focused more on, should there be more stringent regulation governing what the food industry does, essentially? Michael, you're kind of in that sector, in between food and medicines.
I'm not a specialist in food supplements and health claims. I mean, what we see is that there's a certain path that has been taken by the EFSA, and I think that's a strategy or a path that you cannot simply change. I think it's up to the industry, the manufacturers, to come up with good science and to demonstrate compliance in the claim. And I think so far, I mean, EFSA has made some guidelines on it. Everybody is still trying to fit in their old clinical data and trying to, I mean, and we need to redo our homework and come up in that area. But again, I'm not from a health claim perspective. I'm coming from a medical device perspective. The way we look at data is we are searching for the physical mode of action. And so if I look to an ingredient, I'm looking for, okay, how can I make this into a physical mode of action? And that's what we are doing. We're looking for the data in there, and then we're gonna redo the engineering in it. And then we need to do new clinical data, and that takes time. So we're not able to give any solutions in the next 3 years for that. I mean, we're trying to do every year, but it takes time to build it.
Well, Catherine, when you have a whole range of foods and ingredients in which you can't talk about their health benefits, which is the case in a lot of cases here in Europe under the health claims laws, what effect does that have? Is that going to help improve the nutrition of societies across the European Union? Again,
also an area I've not looked at, and I'm not a specialist in. I've looked at, but I'm not a specialist in. But you know, I think clearly the challenge that we have is that whereas with a pharmaceutical drug, you know, that is a scientifically measurable response, and it's also being administered by a specialist. Whereas, you know, in the case of, obviously, as we all know, a food supplement or a food ingredient, you know, that is the consumer that's making that decision. We have no control over the dosage that the consumer may be taking or the mix the consumer may be taking. I think that's the challenge that we face. And you know, we're dealing with, whereas a pharmaceutical drug is dealing with a chronic disease, we're dealing with the healthy society, presumably. You know, this is our goal. And you know, we obviously, there has to be a balance there, because we don't want to create a reaction that's going to be negative to health. But on the other hand, there are key benefits that are scientifically proven and well known in most of the ingredients and supplements we're talking about.
So the question is about regulation, or do you think, is the food industry over-regulated? What's their marketing toolbox look like?
Actually, I think that was a really important question, and I'd like to extend some of the points that my fellow panelists have already made. I think that, first of all, you're not a healthy population. And I can say this with great confidence, because the degenerative diseases have long preclinical latency periods. So long before that hip fracture, or the first shadow on the pulmonary x-ray, or your first coronary with your cornflakes, you already have these diseases. You know, as you sit here listening to us, your arteries are silting up, and your brain cells are dying, and cancer cells are forming. You're not a healthy population at all. I think this whole distinction between treating disease and treating healthy populations which do no any longer exist is a nonsense. And the technology, the diagnostic technologies that Catherine was talking about earlier, hugely important. A lot of the companies here are behind that, and some of the technology companies are working together with the food industry to develop systems which will allow us to look at the impact of different types of diet consumed over short periods of time on things like vascular compliance. So we can actually begin to say, yeah, if you eat too much of this stuff, it is going to lead you inevitably down the direction towards your first stroke, or your first heart attack, or your first emerging dependence on pharmaceutical maintenance. I think the regulatory system is all wrong. And the reason is that it's been forced on us by consumer groups, many of whom were initially used as stalking horses by the pharmaceutical industry in a blatant protectionist maneuvering. And the other problem is that we have risk analysis methods which are unidirectional. And that's inappropriate. It's appropriate. I mean, you may have talked to Harman Hofstra about this. Michael, you probably know Harman. Okay.
Who is that?
Harman Hofstra is one of the wonks who was involved in risk analytical methodology, which is used by EFSA. And I've had long conversations with Harman about this. If you're putting a novel compound, a new drug, into a population for the first time, of course you need to do your risk analysis, and it's one directional. What is the chance that a multiple of the normal dose will cause a reaction in a vulnerable section of the population? And you do your work along those kinds of lines. But it's not appropriate to look at nutrients in that way. You need a bidirectional model, because the minimal risks that are associated with the introduction of new nutritional additives into the food chain have to be offset against the much greater risks of not adding them. And they are 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude greater. And until we move to bidirectional risk analysis, the regulatory system will continue to be hobbled, and it will continue to come out with the wrong answers.
Yeah. If you look from the medical device directive, it was supposed to be released before the European new voting was coming up. But they pulled it all back because there is one problem. The strict regulations which are now coming to be enforced, that looks like, is a big discussion, because if they are going to enforce the same system into the drug, what they have done for the drug category into the medical device, they know that they will kill any innovation. And they see now a lot of new innovation coming up in the self-care medical devices. But they are like, okay, do we want it to be like that? Because it's absorbed, it's getting into bloodstreams, should that be a medical device? And then we have many discussions going on right now in the European Commission about should a medical device being absorbed in your GI tract into your bloodstream. And if we have these kind of discussions, I mean, we can make coffee regulated as drug if we want to, right? So that you have to realize, I mean, we are having absorption levels, and that by definition does not make it into a drug. It's how do you treat the disease which makes it into a drug? And we should not be using antibiotics for everything. That's not the solution, right?
But Michael, can we afford not to increasingly regulate the industry, given the public health costs we're now facing? Do any of you remember Ralph Nader? Does that name mean anything to you?
The American left-winger.
I'm not sure if he was a left-winger or not. I mean, I met him. He was a very bright guy. He wasn't really a left-winger at all. And I'm certainly not a left-winger. But what he did, he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And this was in response to a car designed by Ford called the Pinto, which was so badly designed that if it was run into at the back at a speed of more than 5 miles an hour, it would burst into flames and barbecue its inhabitants. And Ralph Nader thought that this was not a good state of affairs, and he started badgering Detroit, saying, you've got to stop building safety into your cars. It's not a question of longer tail fins or sexier grills. You need to start making them safe for the people who drive them. And he wrote this book which captured public opinion, and public opinion then forced Detroit to start putting into the cars the safety features we now take for granted, such as crumple zones and seat belts and very basic things like that. And we wouldn't go back for the world. We need an equivalent message, a clarion call to the consumerate, telling them about the dangers of the current food universe. The food environment, this toxic environment that I keep on talking about. And the food industry, I mean, Margaret Chan partly did that last year. And I think she created an invaluable foundation on which we can build, but much more needs to be done.
If we move on to take a slightly different tack, what do the panelists think of the, shall we say, trend where you have, say, Nestle, the world's biggest food company, who a few years ago set up the Nestle Institute for Health Science? And then on the other side, you have an increase, and they're essentially researching nutritional interventions that can have medical effects in a whole range of conditions, from heart disease to brain health and more. And then at the same time, you have a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are showing an increasing interest in the food industry, and so there does seem to be, at some levels at least, a convergence going on. What do you make of this? Do you see it as a potentially positive development? Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, clearly you mentioned Nestle or some of the other larger companies. I mean, this is a clear there's a clear trend, as I mentioned initially, that is, partially consumer-driven, but it's also demand-driven because health is costing too much, and there are also clear benefits on that side. So I mean, the industry is very mature already today, and is obviously attracting that attention with very mature solutions. And I think many of the companies, in fact, that we have at Vitafoods have similarly these solutions available.
Do you think that consumers would trust a drug company to make foods?
I think the consumers are clearly ever more critical and also aware of, and also some of the comments Paul made about toxicity, etc. So I think hence, I think many of the solutions that we're seeing in the food industry, some of the future solutions are actually based on more natural ingredients. One example is some of the drinks companies, some of the fruit drinks companies who were previously using artificial flavorings, now looking towards natural ingredients like anthocyanins that have clear health benefits. And I think that is a trend that is going to continue.
If you were going to get bought out by somebody, Michael, would you rather be bought by a drug company or a food company?
I'd rather be bought by a drug company then. No, I think they have better knowledge about how to do the clinical data, but what I'm worried about right now is the movement you see in the food supplements, where if you talk, for example, about urinary tract infections, where we are facing competition where people are not using cranberries, they still put the cranberries on the package, but they're using an unhold botanical, and that's how they're promoting the product. And for me, that's also like misleading the consumer, right? And this is what's happening right now. And that's the problem, I think.
But I feel like maybe an additional subject is that there's significant further potential in a lot of new other areas that have possibly not been investigated to a large extent today. I mean, if you look at some of the growth in some of the areas, like with whey, just to take one example, it's been a very highly effective form of protein. And there's the growth that we've seen in that area, and I think some of the areas, for example, like in sports nutrition that we experience, that products that have been available in the past, are actually attracting a much broader group of consumers because they're facing similar challenges like endurance, performance, energy, that are actually just they're actually typical demands of us on society today. So I think, whereas there may be major companies merging in, there are significant areas that are also maybe creating additional potential.
Some interesting unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to wind things up. We're running out of time. Paul, what would your final comments be on this subject?
What I see here is enormous potential, but it's not being actualized yet. I'd like to see more coordination between vested interests, both corporate and governmental and regulatory. But then, if you believe in that's going to happen, then you believe in unicorns and pixie dust.
What's your message to the food industry, the healthy food industry that you see here at Vitafoods?
Assume the responsibility that Margaret Chan laid at your doorsteps last year and do something about it. Smarten up your act. You have a huge ethical responsibility to do so. I'm so sorry, I can't stay now.
Okay, well, we're going to wind it up. Thank you, Paul, Catherine, and Michael for taking part in this debate about the rise and future of medical foods. And thank you all for coming along. Hope you got something out of it. If you have any other questions, come and see the guys direct. And see you again at Vitafoods 2015. Thank you very much.